Hi, welcome to the first video of our lecture series. Today we're going to be talking about the history and the development of the Divine Liturgy. Starting with the 1st century, St. Paul in AD 52, as we know in the epistles, we are able to see the first instance of a Eucharistic service. The focus of the service was around the Eucharist, and it creates the atmosphere of the Last Supper. We believe that it was a common meal, gathered in secret. Too much indulgence, unfortunately, led the Eucharist being separated from this meal. The remembrance of Jesus then came in the form of bread and wine rather than a meal. Synagogue-style service was then attached, including scriptural readings. So from what we know, according to the epistles, the early version of the liturgy consisted mostly of the Eucharist representing the Last Supper, and then attaching with some type of scriptural readings. The next recording we get regarding the Divine Liturgy happened in the mid-2nd century, with St. Justin Martyr. We believe that it consisted of first scriptural readings followed by a sermon, then intercessions, the kiss of peace, and then the Eucharist. Once again, we have synagogue-like services with the Eucharist at the end. So within about 100 years, we have just about the same type of service going on. Just a little bit of additions such as the kiss of peace along with a sermon. Now we come to the late 4th century, and this is where we really start to see a bit more of the elements that make up the Divine Liturgy that we have today. We begin with the bishop's entrance, followed by scriptural readings interspersed with psalms, the sermon, an extended litany of the faithful, the kiss of peace, washing of the hands, transfer of gifts with fans, apostolic blessing, Eucharistic dialogue, and anaphora, the Lord's Prayer as the pre-communion prayer, let us attend and holy gifts are for the holy, Holy Communion, post-communion thanks, and a prayer of inclination, final blessing, and dismissal. So continuing from the time of Justin Martyr, we have the sermon, we have the kiss of peace, intercessions, and the Eucharist. But now we have quite a few extra types of events going on interspersed throughout the liturgy. One of the most important things added, which we'll talk about in another video, is the anaphora. So by the late 4th century, emphasis on old tradition of the Eucharist as the sacrifice is contained, but with the added additions of the propitiatory sacrifice. This is reflected in the anaphora. We also see that the Eucharistic prayer became a fixed text. St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil liturgies then appear. Their anaphoras are from the Codex Barberini, then they are different. These two liturgies may be similar in order to the Clementine liturgy with different prayers. The Clementine liturgy was the one I just referenced on the past slide. So by the end of the 4th century, we start to see a lot more of this text that we see about today. A lot more structure and a lot more elements are then added, especially with the St. John Chrysostom and with St. Basil the Great, with their contributions with their liturgies. Going ahead to the mid-7th century, with commentary from St. Maximus the Confessor and St. Germanus, we have what the liturgy looks like at this time. The liturgy begins with the entrance, but refers to the bishop, clergy, and all the faithful into the nave. We then have readings from the Old Testament, Epistle, and Gospel, interspersed with psalmody. This is followed with a sermon, prayer for catechumens, their dismissal, and closing of the nave doors. We see the transfer of gifts with ceremony. This is the early version of the Great Entrance. We have the lavabo, or the washing of the hands, the kiss of peace, and the incorporation of the creed. Following this is the apostolic blessing, Eucharistic dialogue, and the St. Basil anaphora. The Lord's Prayer is then added as a pre-communion prayer. The Zion, or the boiling hot water, is now added to the consecrated chalice. At this time, Holy Communion is still in the hand. Not 100% sure what that means. This is followed with the post-communion prayer, Let Our Mouth Be Filled, and post-communion prayer of thanksgiving and the diaconal dismissal. So a lot more prayers and praises are added during this time. We can see these a lot more today, and this is where they originated from. The Codex Barberini is found in the 8th and 9th century, is the oldest full manuscript of the Divine Liturgy. To spare some time and details, I'm just going to summarize what exactly was found. We see the beginning of a ritualized prothesis service. The antiphons are then chanted before the entrance. A great litany is now occurring before the trisagion, and an ectenia is said after the gospel and homily. We also find in the Codex that the spoon for communion is then added. So quite a while, actually. So by the end of the first millennium, we're able to see that the liturgy is very recognizable to us today, except it still directly begins with the entrance with the gospel. The first ritual action of the liturgy then was the blessing of the bishop with peace to all before the scriptural readings. Antiphons were said on the way to church, and while the faithful awaited the arrival of the hierarch, the great litany was said before or during the Trisagion, as it was processional. A fervent ectenia came to be said directly after the gospel. Finally, symbolic meaning of the liturgy was developed by Saints Germanos and Maximus the Confessor, based on the symbolic theology of Dionysius the Areopagite. So now by this point, all of the elements of the Divine Liturgy, roughly as we see them today, have now been introduced in some sort of order. That last point, though, is very important to see, with St. Germanos and St. Maximus talking about symbolic meaning within the Divine Liturgy. You see, this addition of symbolism starts to paint a lot more picture and adds a lot more significance to the Divine Liturgy, as we will later see. Finally, we have the development in the 14th century of St. Philotheos, the Patriarch of Constantinople. Philotheos introduced his Diataxis, which determined what exactly the Divine Liturgy would end up becoming and exactly how we do it today. So, processions are no longer beginning from other buildings. The entrance is now the little entrance, taking the gospel from the holy table and back. The transfer of gifts is now the great entrance. Priests take and deposit gifts on the table instead of deacons. Only the hierarch says prayers before the deposition of bread and wine on the table, except for the presbyterial liturgy. The iconostasis screen is complete, sealing away the view from the altar and table. Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom is now the default, but St. Basil is used for special feasts. The lavabo, now transferred to post-vesting, away from the great entrance. Prayers or psalm verses are now accompanying the vesting of the priest. And finally, the Life of Christ symbolism from Nicholas of Andida and Nicholas Kabasilas is added, especially during the Proscomedia. We will look more into the Life of Christ symbolism later on in our lecture series, pictured here and here. So summarizing it all up, we have the development from St. Paul from about 50 AD up till the Diataxis of St. Philotheos around 1350 AD, so about 1300 years of liturgical development. Not really much has been added to the Divine Liturgy since that time, about 650 years. We see a few differences here and there between the Greek services, the Antiochian services, the Russian services, but the core of what we've introduced is the same. So for the remaining videos of this lecture series, we're going to be looking more in depth on each individual part, along with their commentary, their meaning, and further history into what they became to today. Thank you for joining me today on this video, and see you in the next one.